Hello, I'm Mike Browning. Welcome to Let God Speak. God works in unexpected and often simple ways to attract the attention of the whole world and its leaders. And today on Let God Speak, we're going to look at the lives of some people whose simple faith and integrity impressed the entire world. Well, on our panel today, we have Barry Harker and Adrian Craig. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming to join us today.
Great
and we'd like to invite you to join with us in prayer to begin with. Father in heaven, we are thankful that we can share together the amazing story of Daniel today. And I pray that your Spirit will guide us as we share and as we study this subject. And we want to understand the power, the source of power in Daniel's life. Please, Lord, in Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
Amen. Well, Daniel is one of the most outstanding men in biblical history when you think about Daniel. What do we know about him, Barry?
Well, he was a captive. He was only a teenager, probably 18, 17, when he arrived in Babylon.
Yes.
He became a civil servant, an advisor, and later he was the prime minister of 2 world kingdoms. And he's also exercised an enormous influence, not only on Jewish and Christian history, but also on world history. That period that he was living was called the Axis period of Earth's history, and lots of changes took place at that time, particularly the rise of major world religions. And I believe that as people saw Daniel, saw his witness, they tried to borrow from him things that would bolster their own religious positions. So he's had an enormous influence both in a religious and a secular sense.
Okay, well, thank you for that. We need to look at what made, in his life, made such an impact. I mean, he's come into a heathen environment from probably a fairly sheltered Hebrew environment back home, and he's going to be challenged, isn't he, by some of the things that he faces. And one of the most interesting ones is what happened when he first arrived in Babylon. They'd made this huge trip from Israel to Babylon, must have been worn out and probably hadn't had good food along the way, who knows. As soon as they arrived, this takes place. Chapter 1 of Daniel, verse 5. The king appointed them, that's Daniel, his 3 friends, and of course a whole bunch of other young Israelite boys. He appointed them a daily provision of the king's food and of the wine which he drank. So they were given the best, as the Babylonians saw it, the best food possible, so nourishing them for 3 years that at the end of that time they might stand before the king. So he gives them the best that he can possibly find, and so, you know, you'd think that they'd appreciate that, and they probably do. Could this pose a problem to them? This could hardly pose a problem, you'd think.
Well, eating caused trouble in the first place.
You had in mind?
Adam and Eve.
Yes, of
One
course.
bite of an apple and we'd have been in trouble for 6,000 years.
That's right.
Only a little thing, not important, a lot of people would say. What about Jesus' experience with the devil tempting him, stones to bread?
Yes, make these stones into bread.
Eating again.
He could have done that, what's more.
Yes, he could have. So little things, insignificant, are important.
Okay, so you don't see
Daniel
him
was
overlooking that.
No, I think Daniel understood the importance of diet to his self-control, to his character, to his relationship to God. And he knew this was going to be an issue because there was an explicit instruction not to eat pork, and that would have been on his menu. And so he realised that he had a choice to make at this point. If he compromised, then he was going to have to compromise on all of these other things down the line.
All right, so
he knew this was crucial to him maintaining his own religious commitment.
Yes.
And relationship with God.
Thank you, Barry.
And now there's something we ought to notice, that he not only took a stand on diet, but he also took a stand on his name.
Okay.
No compromise on the diet, but there was no compromise also on the name. Now, it doesn't look that way when you read it, but if you read in the original, what Daniel said is, I don't want a Babylonian god name. And all the names that were given to the boys are actually changed. He inserted letters in them. So the name ends up being a gobbledygook, like Craig's my name. If I put XY in Craig, it'd say where did you hail from?
That's right. You know, it's interesting too what Jesus said about the importance of what might be considered little things. In chapter 16, verse 10 of Luke, Jesus says, "He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much. He that is unjust in the least is unjust in much." So that's a deep insight into the importance of what might be considered small matters of principle, but still matters of principle. And in fact, we're training ourselves for the big issues of life.
Well, a small matter does matter.
It does.
A stone in your shoe, and you have trouble walking. It's only a little pebble,
Yes.
and a little bit of
Pretty
dust,
uncomfortable, isn't it?
and a little bit of dust in your eye, and your vision is blurred.
That's
Yeah.
right.
You only need a drop of vitamin B12 to keep you alive.
Yeah. Yes.
Little thing.
Okay, so Daniel's faced with this little test, right? Over
Well,
the food.
a seemingly little test.
Seemingly little test. Thank you for putting that word seemingly in there. And what does he do, Adrian?
Well, the text very clearly says in Daniel 1 verse 8 that he purposed in his heart. He made a firm decision.
Okay.
He was very committed to proper resolve over the diet issue.
Okay.
Now, notice he didn't dilly-dally. He didn't say, well, I'm going to take time out and I'll meditate on this. I'll ring up Mama back in Jerusalem and say, what do I do? He didn't say that. No. He resolved, he purposed in his heart at that particular point. You know, someone as well said, the moment we dilly-dally, we are giving in to the temptation.
Okay. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? Until a person, or we, make a decision about something, nothing's going to happen. And certainly nothing's going to change, that's for sure. So he made this decision that he wouldn't change. What was the result of him purposing in his heart here?
Well, it wasn't, like Barry has said, I mean, they had very clear laws on what to eat. So this wasn't a matter of whether you have salt or pepper, or whether you'd have So Good, soya milk, or whether you'd have cow's milk or almond milk. This was a high principled issue that had to do with prohibitions.
Yes.
And so Daniel said, well, do you test us out? See how we fare on our fare.
And he gave him a 10-day test, which is rather interesting, wasn't it? You know?
Well, I think the fact is that Daniel would have known that he was going to come out of this okay, because he would have been on this diet back in Israel. So it's highly likely that he knew what the outcome would be if he was given that opportunity at the test.
And because they just arrived after this long trek through the desert, right, from Israel.
They wouldn't have been looking so good.
They wouldn't have been looking
at the
too
end of
good.
that,
So it was a good time for such a test.
Yes.
This could be considered the first clinically controlled test comparing a vegetarian with a non-vegetarian diet, couldn't it? Because that's the way it ended up. By the way, verse 15 in Daniel chapter 1 tells us what did happen at the end.
They looked better nourished and healthier.
That's it. At the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh. They'd filled out and taken up what they'd lost on the way. Then all the children who ate the portion of the king's food, so apparently all the other young fellows who came with them from Israel didn't stand up for principle. But these young men did, and I think that's fantastic. Had he compromised, Barry, would we have known Daniel's name today, do you think?
No. Do we know the names of any of those people who bowed to the golden image?
No, we don't, do we?
Well, there's the answer. The answer's no.
No. And would he have become the greatest prophetic voice of the Old Testament? That's another thought.
No.
If he'd compromised on what might be considered by some a small matter.
Well, that's why I think the story's here. Why do we start on this story? Because this is the crux of the matter. If you don't stand on a smaller principle, you're not going to stand on a larger one.
That's right. And this faithfulness continued all his life through, didn't it?
What do you think would have happened at that golden image if they'd failed this test?
Yeah, that's right.
Well, I mean, the golden image came out of the image in Daniel chapter 2, so maybe it would have happened in a different way. But there would have been a test sometime down the track that they would have failed because they had failed to stand on this particular
And remember that character is not produced in the crisis.
before the crisis.
Character is produced before the crisis.
Yes.
So these little warm-ups, preparing the way for the big test that we'll notice in chapter 3.
Okay.
And I think, Mike, it's important to notice there is a connection between mental acuity and accomplishment academically and the care of the physical. And you'll notice in the text it says, and God gave the boys wisdom. And you remember when Nebuchadnezzar came in, which I find intriguing that the king is doing the orals.
That's right.
He's checking
He
them out.
tests them.
Yeah.
So he was a clever man himself.
Yeah.
So this is really good. He was no fool.
And he found them to be 10 times more intelligent than the others. So don't miss the fact that there is a relationship between the diet and the academic success that's recorded here in chapter 1.
And the spiritual life, because there was something outstanding about Daniel that we noticed, and that was he was a spirit-filled, prayer-focused man, wasn't he? And
yeah, that prayer life was absolutely central to who he was. You notice that before all the great crises, he was a man of prayer, and he refused to give up prayer, even at the potential cost of his life.
okay.
So this prayer life of Daniel's was absolutely central to who he was as a person and his relationship with God.
And probably gave him the courage to stand up for principle, even in these seemingly small things. How many people does God need to impact the world? Now, you think about this for a moment for us, Adrian.
Well, he sent one son.
Yes?
He didn't send a whole stack of angels.
No.
You only need one man to go to Nineveh,
Jonah.
and Noah to preach to the antediluvian world. And there was one man on Carmel who said, how long halt you between two opinions? So God, you know, I think you've highlighted this in a previous program. God's not indebted to numbers.
No. No.
He can do it with nothing.
And he did it with one man here. That's right, he did it with one hand. So that was the first great test, and they passed that with flying colours.
Yes.
And it set the scene for their entire lives there in Babylon, which is fascinating to me. There's another story over in chapter 3 of Daniel, which we could turn to. And in this story, Nebuchadnezzar decides to build a statue, and it's probably designed on this vision of the statue of chapter 2, which we're not looking at right now today.
Same word, Mike.
Yes.
Image.
Okay, yes, it is. And he makes it out of gold, and he's going to make everybody bow down and worship this, a symbol of himself, no doubt, and his great power of Babylon. And he puts this statue out on the plain. I'd like to read about it in chapter 3. And starting at verse 1, it says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold. Its height was 60 cubits. This is about 30 metres high, right? And the breadth of it was 6 cubits, and he set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And the plan was that he would call in all the great leaders of the empire, and he would get them to worship this, and he had an orchestra planned, and when the orchestra played this moving music, no doubt, then at that moving moment they would fall down before this golden statue.
Yes.
The National Orchestra there,
I'd say it was.
under the baton of the visiting conductor.
Yeah, it even gives us a whole list of the type of instruments that they had. For example, chapter 3, verse 5. At the time, this is the instruction, by the way, at the time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, and psaltery, and so on, you fall down and worship the gold image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And if you don't, that's the next verse, 6, if you don't fall down and worship, you shall that same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace, a nasty end. We move into this amazing test. And by the way, the 3 friends of Daniel were there. We know them as Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, but Daniel's name isn't mentioned. Do you suppose Daniel didn't bow down, or what happened here?
He was either ill or off on some other business, because I'm sure the king knew that he was a man of principle and that he wasn't going to bow, but perhaps he'd forgotten about his 3 companions.
I think that's probably the case myself.
It is possible, of course, that Daniel was so high up, related to what you're saying, Barry, is so high up that this test did not need to be given to him. But he wasn't there. But if anybody's concerned about what he would have done had he been there, I say go to chapter 6.
Okay.
Because this is a man who's prepared to go to a lion's den rather than stop praying.
Yes.
Okay.
Is that sort of man going to bow down?
Yeah.
Okay, so the music plays and everybody bows down, except standing amongst this sea of backs is
3 young men.
3 young men. A beautiful story, and this is what it says in chapter 3, verse 12. Of course, the king's friends come up and say, hey, there are certain Jews whom you've set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. They knew their names all right, don't you worry about that.
So this would have been more serious because they were government officials. And I believe that's why
well known.
they were given a second chance.
Okay, because that's what he goes on to say, that they haven't worshipped the image. Nebuchadnezzar's furious, brings them up, has them brought up, And then when he recognises who they are,
Yes.
I think he probably kicks himself.
He stuttered.
Yeah.
I don't know. Why didn't I send them off to
Yes.
do a special?
Yes.
You know, I'm sure that he felt that way about it. So he gives them
And
a
that would have
second
also
chance.
been an indication that he had a
Mm.
conscience about what was going on too, as
Yeah.
well, wouldn't it?
Yes, I think he was somewhat stressed about this.
I think at this point he would have been thinking maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all.
Right. Anyhow, gives them a second chance, and they respond in this manner. It's still in chapter 3 and verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, they answer the king and they say, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful, it says in the Old King James, to answer you. In other words, we don't hesitate, they really mean. We're not hesitating to answer you. If it is so that our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. They knew that, actually.
Mm.
And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. However, if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your God nor worship the gold image. So they didn't know for sure God was going to save them.
But there was a promise in the Old Testament which might have come across their minds at that stage, and that's Isaiah 43 and verse 2. Perhaps, I'll just pull that up.
When you pass through the waters, I'll be with you.
It says, when thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee.
Yeah,
And that's basically what happens here.
yeah, yeah.
So
And
perhaps
read
that
the
was,
verse.
so perhaps that was in their minds at that
It may
time.
well have been, but they didn't know for sure, which is why they said what they said. But they knew God could do this,
Yeah.
save them if he needed to.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so they went into the fiery furnace.
That's real faith, Mike.
Oh, it is.
I can say God will be with me when I'm in an A380,
Mhm.
but if it crashes, am I still prepared to say He's with me?
Mm.
That's what they're saying.
Yes.
Even if it comes out bad, that doesn't mean that God is not with me.
Mm.
That's,
No,
what
true.
that's faith that is beyond all of us.
Yes.
It
Or
is.
maybe I should say most of us.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, now, they're thrown into the furnace because of their refusal to bow down and worship this image. Nebuchadnezzar's really mad this time, which is why he does it. He has the thing heated up 7 times hotter, so it's white hot. And it even slays the guards throwing them in. When they open the door, out come the flames, finishes these poor fellows. And verse 23 of chapter 3 says, these 3 men fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And they might have fallen down bound into the flames, but they didn't stay there apparently. Then the king was astonished, it says, and he rose up in haste. He got up in a hurry and said to his counselors, didn't we throw 3 men into the fire? They said, yes, we did, king. He said, I see 4 men loose in there, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. How did he know about that?
Because of what we read in chapter 1 and chapter 2. This is about witness. This is about mission. And these boys were exemplifying in lifestyle what serving God was all about.
Yes.
But I wanted you to notice that they didn't just rely on what they did. They also they articulated their message.
And when Nebuchadnezzar's actually setting up this whole situation, he's setting himself up for failure, essentially, isn't he?
He was, wasn't he?
And in this case, he knew that the God of these 3 young men was more powerful than his gods. So he had another opportunity to know from these.
It was not a
Larry,
step
he
for
was
him.
a slow learner.
He was like all of us, but it was another step, just the same, it was another step of faith for him. Look, he did something interesting after this, didn't he, Nebuchadnezzar? This is verse 29 of chapter 3. He said, I make a decree that every people, nation and language who speak anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a public privy, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. This was a powerful statement. Does
It
sound-
was. He didn't have much concept of religious liberty, though, did he?
He didn't understand the compassion and love of God. There's no doubt about it. But he's impressed by the power of God. He's got that part.
But he's not yet acknowledging that it's his God.
That's right.
Because
That's true, isn't it? Yeah.
chapter 3 is all about the contest of the gods.
Yes.
And you referred to setting up the image, Mike.
Yes.
And 8 times in the first, 15 verses, that setup is used. So the God of heaven sets up a kingdom in chapter 2 that will never be destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar is now saying, set up, set up, set up. I do the setup, not you. So it's the contest of the gods.
So he's learned a lot, hasn't he? So how many people does God need, faithful people, to get a message across to the world?
Just one.
Just one, because that's all. Well, it took 3 in this case.
3 in that case.
That was a decree that went to the entire world, saying, "Don't you worship any other god but Daniel's God."
But Mike, Barry, imagine what would happen if every Christian, can I say it this way, was a Daniel. We might baptise a few more PMs.
We might indeed. Now, moving on in Daniel's life now, when Daniel was about 80 years of age, Babylon itself as an empire was in crisis. They were surrounded, Babylon the city was surrounded by the Persians and the Medes combined, and their armies, and in desperation they turned to Daniel for help. This is after they see that handwriting, that ghostly handwriting on the wall. And how do they describe Daniel? They call for Daniel. How is he described by these people?
A man in whom the spirit of the gods resides.
Don't you just love that? Don't you love it? It's in chapter 5. And the Queen, first of all, says that. She says, "There's a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods." This is chapter 5, verse 11. The spirit of the holy gods, and you've got to understand where they're coming from. They believe in multiple gods. And he talks about the man being Daniel, being part of the court scene in the times of Nebuchadnezzar. And then when Daniel comes in to the king, brought in, the king himself says in verse 14, "I have even heard about you that the Spirit of God, the gods, is in you."
Well, look back in verse 12. It says, "For as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences, dissolving of doubts." This man was clearly an outstanding,
Wasn't he?
And this
individual.
king,
Yes.
and this king, don't miss it, this king is arrogant.
Yes, he is.
Are you one of the POWs? Now, come on.
That's how he addresses him.
This guy has saved the throne for him. When Nebuchadnezzar was out on grass, who was caring for the kingdom? And Belshazzar inherits the kingdom. Are you Daniel? He doesn't say, "Are you Belshazzar?" which was his real name, which was his Babylonian name. He says, "Are you Daniel?" He knew about him. So, and Daniel gives him a serve.
He does. He does. He doesn't mince words here at this point in time. But Daniel excelled himself. I just think that the fact that they recognise this about Daniel, this is an inspiration to us as believers today, isn't it? To be known as people who the Spirit of God is in us, bringing out all of those beautiful characteristics that define the God of love, compassion and kindness that we know. And what a blessing to be part of that. So Daniel Daniel was a man of integrity, and it was just known. Beautiful thing.
And you'll notice when you read the rest of the story in Daniel 5 that Daniel recites the experience of his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar. He says, "You've had all the evidence of your grandfather's life, who was converted." And Mike, we mustn't miss this. We're talking about mission and the fact that these boys were vigorous, what's the word I want? Missionaries, witnesses for Jesus. We got Nebuchadnezzar. God had to put him out on grass for 7 years before he woke up.
But he did wake up.
But he did wake up. He was thoroughly converted. The end of chapter 4. So mission says that. So mission has been successful in the case of Nebuchadnezzar, and God wrestled with him for 40 years. How good is God?
Yeah, amazing and patient. So the Medes and the Persians successfully conquer Babylon, right? They do actually get through on this occasion. And because of Daniel's reputation, he's kept on in the new administration. Don't you find that rather
I find that incredible.
Yeah.
Or you would say, Mike, a new broom what?
A new broom sweeps clean, and you'd expect that to happen, wouldn't you? But it didn't on this occasion. They kept Daniel on.
And he was known as a man with inflexible principle.
Yes, and that was why,
and that was probably in short supply. And so I think that would have been one of the attractions.
They wouldn't have been sorry they kept him on either. Notice in chapter 6, verse 3, Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes. So, and because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm, that's what the king planned. And of course, this brought about a tremendous challenge to Daniel. And just to make the story very brief, because our time is short here now, Daniel was threatened with, a decree was issued saying that no one could pray to anyone but the king, And Daniel continued to pray to God and was
So you
thrown
get
into
this,
the lion's
you get
den.
this irrevocable law. It can't be
Yes.
changed, like an early version of infallibility.
Yes.
And on the other side of the, on the other side of the situation, you have this inflexible principle. So they knew that they had Daniel, but they hadn't factored in that God was in the equation as well.
Yes, no, that's fantastic, isn't it? God knew what he was doing when he chose Daniel. So,
Sorry, Mike.
yeah, I was going to say, so how many people does God need to reach the entire world?
Just one.
Just one.
Do you
Because, yeah, go on, Adrian. Let's hear it, man.
What do you think happened to Darius? Now, we said that Daniel's witness... and
Darius the king.
Yeah, Daniel's witness was so effective to Nebuchadnezzar that Nebuchadnezzar, you'll meet him in glory, got a hard time hooking him, but he got him.
Yes.
But what about Darius? It's interesting to me that the chapter that we're noting in chapter 6 ends up the same way as chapter 4.
Yes.
Nebuchadnezzar, I praise and extol the God of heaven because he's the King of kings.
Yes.
It sounds the same language at the end of chapter 6. I wonder. I don't know, you might be able to help.
I'm impressed with what effect this had on Darius, because, you know, Daniel was saved from the lion's den, right? God saved him miraculously.
And those proclamations that Adrian's talked about would have highlighted Daniel's writings. So his writings would have been known right across the known world.
They would have.
That's why they were immensely influential, I believe.
So,
And I love the decree here.
Yeah.
You're going to read the
no,
decree.
No, you read it, Mike.
Well, okay, verse 26, I make a decree, says Darius. This goes to the entire world, don't forget, that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God,
Yes.
steadfast forever, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. He delivers and rescues, works signs and wonders. Man, this is a tremendous build-up, isn't it, to the power and might of God. Well, look, just very quickly, we need to remind ourselves that that powerful witness is to be repeated.
Yes.
Because in Revelation chapter 14 and verse 6, there's a wonderful prophecy describing a people who take the gospel to the world at the end of time once more. And it says something nice about them. In chapter 14, verse 5 of Revelation, it says, in them is no deceit. So these are people who stand out like Daniel.
Could be trusted.
Spirit-filled people who could be trusted, and God could rely on them.
Mike, can I suggest you read Daniel 12:3 to summarise it all?
We don't have time. I don't think.
don't have
No, we don't have
right.
time. Folks, we're going to have to finish it up right there. In that same dramatic, world-changing way that God used Daniel, he can use anyone who's willing to be faithful and is prepared to tell his story and be a person of integrity. Numbers are never God's problem. We've learned that. Humble people of faith and integrity, whether many or few, these are God's greatest resource. Thank you for joining us on Let God Speak today. God bless you, each one.